Listen to any actor or director from classic Hollywood talk about Greta Garbo, and you'd swear they were talking about a ghost. She was someone you might catch a glimpse of, there one moment and gone the next. And those lucky few who did interact with her were overwhelmed by her presence, stunned into a pure state of awe. Joan Crawford was left breathless after a simple introduction. A conversationalist like Dick Cavett managed only to anxiously sputter out a silly line about vegetables. The examples go on and on. The mysteriousness of Greta Garbo comes just as much from what she did on the screen as what she did off. The woman once deemed the world's greatest, most enigmatic star, one day gave it all up, never to act again. No appearances at award shows, interviews, or screenings. Her deep commitment to her isolation became a new obsession in and of itself. Why did she leave? Why didn't she want to come back? In this video, I want to explore the beginning of the end of her career. Ninotchka, the film that rebranded Garbo for a late 1930s audience, and the controversial follow-up that failed to capitalize on her recent success, Two-Faced Woman. How did these films build on her persona, and how did they contribute to her eventual decision to retire from acting? Before we get started, I want to give a huge thanks to Mubi for sponsoring this video. Mubi is a curated streaming service dedicated to elevating great cinema from around the globe, and you can get a whole month free at mubi.com/BeKindRewind. To understand the end of Greta Garbo's career, we have to understand the beginning. In 1925, Greta Garbo, formerly known as Greta Gustafsson, ventured to the United States from Stockholm, Sweden, where she had recently completed her first two leading film roles in the saga of Gösta Berling and Joyless Street. MGM was impressed with her screen tests and wanted to officially test the young actress with American audiences. First came Torrent in 1926, then The Temptress, both of which were successful enough to encourage the studio to believe in her potential. But it was Flesh and the Devil in 1926 that finally confirmed that they had a major star on their hands. Paired with John Gilbert, Garbo demonstrated a simmering eroticism and sincere tenderness that bewitched the country. In a context where acting typically relied on exaggeration to evoke emotion, Garbo brought a stillness and subtlety to the screen that essentially redefined the function of a close-up. People have written very elegantly about Garbo's effect on screen. Kenneth Tynan comes to mind. He wrote in Sight and Sound in 1954, "What, when drunk, one sees in other women, one sees in Garbo sober. To watch her is to achieve direct, cleansed perception of something which, like a flower or a fold of silk, is raptly, unassertively, and beautifully itself. Tranced by the ecstasy of existing, she gives to each onlooker what he needs." I'll put it more bluntly. Sometimes you truly just see a shot of Greta Garbo, especially in her early silent films, and you're just like, oh my God, I wish I could be as eloquent as Tynan, but there is something actually inexplicable about watching her that even Billy Wilder could not articulate. The face, that face, what is it about that face, he said. You could have read into it all the secrets of a woman's soul. MGM's head of production, Irving Thalberg, knew that whatever it was Garbo had was now the studio's greatest asset and set to work on developing her persona. As Mark Vieira describes in his book, Greta Garbo, A Cinematic Legacy, he soon landed on a reliable formula for her films. In every film henceforth, Garbo would be an ageless, mysterious beauty encountered in a picturesque setting by an idealistic young man who soon discovers that she is married to or being kept by an older man. She wasn't a vamp, nor was she an ingenue. She was a kind of deity, remote and untouchable, but altogether alluring and pristine. She had a European appeal that to most Americans felt exotic and sophisticated. Her characters traveled to the farthest corners of the earth, wearing elegant gowns, and became involved in love affairs with the highest stakes, and audiences loved every minute of it. Robert Dance writes in his book, The Savvy Sphinx: How Garbo Conquered Hollywood, Garbo's supercharged eroticism was perfectly suited to the social climate of the mid-1920s. Adultery and divorce were catnip to post-World War I audiences. It's hard to oversell how famous Garbo became. She was the ultimate star, a woman who blurred myth and reality. Unmatched on screen and practically a hermit in real life, fans would always crave more, but she would tantalizingly leave them wanting. Her 1930 film, Anna Christie, introduced a new element of her skill, her voice. Seeing the tagline "Garbo Talks" on billboards around the country, audiences flocked to see their favorite star speak for the first time. The 1930s then allowed her to take on even more new dimensions. She became famous for the oft-parodied line, "I want to be alone." She transgressed gender norms in Queen Christina. She broke hearts in Camille and Anna Karenina. Still, MGM's commitment to the formula remained steadfast. Garbo, it seems, had made an art of suffering beautifully. Molly Haskell writes, "Suffering, when it is so exquisitely felt and expressed, is no longer suffering, but an art, a symbol of suffering. The man she loves is of less importance than love itself, and it is no accident that her leading men were either weak to begin with or became invisible. For as a figure who combined elements of both sexes, and the ends and the essence of love itself, she usurped the whole screen." She did usurp the whole screen, and boy did she suffer. I made this handy little chart which shows us how often her character dies, how often her love interest dies, and how often she ends up depressingly alone. I didn't get to rewatch all of her films for this video, so take this with a minor grain of salt. But I'm pretty sure this is right, and wow, it's a lot. She dies much more than your average leading lady, and even if no one dies, that doesn't guarantee anyone a good time. Take As You Desire Me from 1932. Nothing on the chart here, but she does play an alcoholic bar dancer suffering from amnesia caused by an injury during World War I. So, the point is, when you have a formula for something, after a while, it can start to feel repetitive. I really like most of Greta Garbo's movies, and yet, I have to be honest, many of them blur together precisely for this reason. You can only get away with doing that for so long. On May 3rd, 1938, a full-page ad in The Hollywood Reporter, taken out by the Independent Theater Owners Association, begged producers to wake up. The stars whose films had made a ton of money earlier in the decade simply weren't cutting it anymore. If the studios themselves weren't going to acknowledge that certain actors' popularity was declining, then these exhibitors were going to do it for them, and publicly. Among the names listed as box office poison were some of the brightest stars of the early 1930s, Marlene Dietrich, Mae West, Joan Crawford, and Greta Garbo. It's likely that MGM would have seen a declaration like this coming. The box office numbers proved that her hold over audiences was waning. Her latest film, 1937's Conquest, yet another forbidden romance in a historical setting with extremely high stakes, was the only real money-losing film of Garbo's career. This presented MGM with a conundrum. They didn't want to cut her loose, she was still very valuable, but they had to reckon with how she fit in a modern context. Tastes evolve. Things get old after a decade. Surely, audiences who lived through the Great Depression and were monitoring the rise of fascism in Europe in real time were searching for something different than the audiences of the Roaring '20s. Even she was bored with her persona by that point. "I'm tired of period pictures, and I want to do something modern now," she told a reporter. "Don't you think it's high time they let me end a picture happily with a kiss? I do." There is also an economic reality to face. As Vieira points out, the studio understood that if war broke out in Europe, MGM would be unable to exhibit films there, which meant losing 2/3 of Garbo's audience. All of this is to say, Garbo needed something fresh to revitalize her deflating popularity, something that would particularly appeal to Americans. Salka Viertel, Garbo's confidant, co-star, and MGM's resident Garbo whisperer, writes in her memoir, The Kindness of Strangers, that it was around this time that producer Gottfried Reinhardt instructed her to find an idea for Garbo's next film. His advice? Keep away from historical topics and convince Garbo to do a comedy for once. Viertel went the other direction and became interested in adapting the then recently released biography of French scientist Marie Curie. That idea spent a lot of time in development, but was eventually shelved altogether. In her memoir, Vertel cites notes from a meeting at MGM in which a producer allegedly said, "Well, guys, last night after dinner I talked to my wife about the story and she agreed with me. No pretty girl would ever study chemistry or physics." Of course, Madame Curie would later be played by Greer Garson for MGM. Anyway, in the midst of the Curie situation, Vertel ran into her good friend, writer Melchior Langell, whose story Love Is Not So Simple seemed like the comedy MGM was looking for. They convinced MGM to purchase the rights, and more importantly, Garbo to star. And thus, Ninotchka was born. Ninotchka follows a delegation of Soviet-Russian bureaucrats who are sent to Paris, tasked with selling jewelry that had belonged to the aristocracy before the Russian Revolution. They need that money to buy food and machinery. The only problem is, an exiled Russian duchess living in Paris claims that those jewels belong to her actually, and not the Soviet state, so she sues the delegation to get them back. Leon, who is essentially the Duchess's live-in boy toy, represents her in the negotiations. One night, he and Ninotchka meet and fall in love, not knowing that they are on opposite sides of the case. What they do know is that they find each other extremely charming. Ninotchka is robotic and humorless, concerned mostly with facts and figures, with avoiding excess, and adhering to Soviet principles. Leon, on the other hand, is a flirty playboy who prefers creature comforts and indulging in glasses of champagne. Opposites attract, chaos ensues, and slowly but surely she sheds her severe Soviet persona and learns to love not only Leon, but the freedom and choice capitalistic Paris ostensibly provides. New hats, glittering dresses, dancing, parties. If you're interested in the politics of this film, I recommend reading Rick McCormick's book, Sex, Politics, and Comedy, The Transnational Cinema of Ernst Lubitsch, which best articulates what I've always found really interesting about Ninotchka, that as much as it might sound like a simplistic communism bad condemnation of the Soviet Union, which was much deserved at this time, given that Stalin had just orchestrated a famine that killed millions and regularly murdered his political opposition, it's not exactly a ringing endorsement of capitalism either. Rather, it should be read in its proper context and considered alongside the democratic socialism of President Roosevelt. Anyway, this Garbo would not die. She wouldn't tragically lose her leading man in the last frame. Just as Anna Christie announced a groundbreaking era for the star with Garbo Talks, MGM smartly determined that Ninotchka merited another similar slogan to signal her next shift. Garbo laughs. The tagline was used everywhere, alerting moviegoers to the new, fun, modern version of their favorite star. The marketing wasn't the only thing MGM got right about Ninotchka. They assembled the perfect comedy team to usher the project to life. Garbo had wanted to work with director Ernst Lubitsch for years, and because he just signed a 2-picture deal with the studio, MGM quickly assigned him to the film. By this point, Lubitsch had the rare distinction of being a kind of celebrity director, not an anonymous cog in a studio machine, but an auteur whose style was so easily recognizable from film to film that it earned its own nickname, the Lubitsch Touch. Characterized by subtle wit, double entendres, and elegant dialogue, he was called the Wizard of High Comedy, master of innuendo, archpriest of that form of humor that tickles the discerning palate like a piquant sauce. He had just started working with a young writing duo who joined him for the screenplay, Billy Wilder and Charles Brackett. Several versions of the story existed before they were assigned to Ninotchka, but the three of them, Wilder, Brackett, and Lubitsch, were given ample time to workshop the script and carve it into something sublime. The odd couple relationship is believable, evolving naturally from harmless flirtation to desire to genuine affection. Melvyn Douglas ably supports Garbo without taking up too much space. The screenplay doesn't throw Garbo into the deep end of comedic performance. It understands her strengths and wields the audience's perceptions of her to its advantage. The somber, serious Garbo of romantic dramas becomes, in comedy, deadpan and severe to the point of absurdity.
You see, a Parisian only goes to the tower in moments of despair to jump off.
How long does it take a man to land?
At times, it nods to Garbo's persona quite literally, with references like waiting on train platforms or wanting to be alone.
We want to be alone.
Ultimately, the film becomes a meta-commentary on Garbo herself. Ninotchka, the character, opens up before our eyes, revealing her previously unseen warmth and charm. In the same way, Ninotchka, the film, opens up Garbo, exploring new hidden depths, unlocking new reasons for audiences to love her. If Garbo's usual purpose was to suffer glamorously, in Ninotchka, she acknowledges that suffering and finally allows us to witness her overcoming it. And how thoroughly she commits, her harsh, resolute delivery of Soviet dogma, her dizzy chuckling at new love, the way she warmly but mournfully reminisces with friends. Audiences and critics adored it. It wasn't just that Garbo laughed, it was that she sang and danced. She drinks champagne and goes all giddy. She kids herself. She buys frivolous hats. It was the tone and tempo of the story, enlivened by whimsical Lubitsch touches. Suddenly, Garbo felt fresh and new, like a human being, and she got some of the best reviews of her career. It must be monotonous, this superb rightness of Garbo's playing, wrote Frank Nugent in the New York Times. We almost wish she would handle a scene badly once in a while, just to provide us with an opportunity to show we are not a member of a fan club. But she remains infallible and Garbo, always exactly what the situation demands, always as fine as her script and director permit her to be. Ninotchka earned $1.1 million at the box office domestically and another $1 million overseas, even without Europe. Garbo earned her final Best Actress nomination, although, well, she was never going to win that one. Obviously, people wanted more of this Garbo. As gossip columnist Luella Parsons put it, the laughing Garbo is 10 times more popular with the fans than the somber lady she used to be. Turning to comedy in Ninotchka, Garbo won the admiration and allegiance of many movie patrons who prior to that film had dismissed her pictures with the excuse that they're too heavy and tragic for me, another paper said. MGM was only too happy to oblige audiences clamoring for more laughs and immediately rushed to reunite her with Lubitsch, though that never quite worked out. It would be 2 years before they found a suitable follow-up, a follow-up seemingly cursed from the beginning. As Salka Vertel explained, what they all would have liked best was a sequel to Ninotchka. Resigned, I gave up arguing and half-heartedly suggested a comedy by Ludwig Fulda, the twin sister. Yes, based on the 1901 play that was then turned into a 1925 silent film called Her Sister from Paris, Two-Faced Woman would take the new Garbo as comedienne, brand, a step further. Melvyn Douglas returns as her love interest, here playing a magazine editor who meets a ski instructor, Karin, and marries her basically the next day. Unsurprisingly, the two of them realize that they don't actually know each other very well. She wants to stay in the mountains and ski, he wants to return to New York City to work. He storms off, and fearful that he might reunite with his former lover, she follows him to the city. Again, chaos ensues, Karin is spotted, and rather than admit that she's spying on her husband, she invents a fake twin sister, Catherine, and pretends to be her for the duration of the trip. Catherine is everything Karin isn't. She dances, she parties, and most importantly, she intervenes in Karin's marriage by thwarting his reunion with his ex and testing how faithful he really is. MGM placed so much faith in Garbo's second turn as a relatable comedienne that they apparently didn't think Two-Faced Woman required the careful curation of behind-the-camera talent that Ninotchka so obviously benefited from. They recklessly slashed the film's budget and refused director George Cukor sufficient time to work with the writers on the screenplay. The insufficient planning inevitably affected the production. Cukor had to improvise the blocking of complex scenes. The script changed day to day, which isn't totally abnormal, but it was absolutely never done on Garbo's films because it put her ill at ease. Scenes that had major implications for the plot were cut at the last minute, and Garbo even had to come back for 2 weeks of reshoots. It was kind of a mess, and things would only get worse. Upon completion of the film, MGM submitted it to the Production Code Administration, who determined that it contained no immoral or illicit material and was suitable for release. Wonderful. MGM assumed everything was fine, released it as usual, and then controversy erupted. Who else but the Legion of Decency, a Catholic group dedicated to policing film for objectionable content, came out of nowhere and condemned Two-Faced Woman for its immoral and unchristian attitude toward marriage and its obligations, imprudently suggestive scenes, dialogue and situations, and suggestive costumes. Recurring villain on the channel, Archbishop Francis Spellman also reared his bulbous head and denounced the film to his New York congregation as an occasion of sin, urging Catholics across the country to skip it. The film was promptly banned in various cities across the country, and Congress even got involved. In a letter to Will Hayes, head of the Production Code Administration, Congressman Martin J. Kennedy demanded that the distribution of the film be halted, and wrote, "I cannot understand how your reviewers could have approached this vile picture so lacking in decent content. The production of this picture must be considered as an affront to the Congress of the United States." This is absolutely an insane thing to say in general, but it's particularly insane if you've seen the movie and know how deeply tame it actually is. Then again, it's hard to judge accurately because 99.9% of people alive today have never actually seen the version the Catholic cavalry decried so vehemently. In a scramble to accommodate the protesters, MGM reassured the public of its commitment to following the production code and invited Archbishop Spellman to meet privately with Louis B. Mayer and suggest edits that would make the film more, quote-unquote, acceptable. Based on his feedback, Douglas was called in to shoot a brief scene that clarifies that his character knows from the beginning that Karen is pretending to be Catherine. So there's never actually any real threat to their marriage, and he's just playing along with her game the whole time. The original version was withdrawn from circulation, and the revised cut was sent to theaters as a replacement. While the original still exists, the revised version has only ever been available for streaming or purchase. For all the furor Two-Faced Woman inspired, I think the real crime is that this film is just not very good, and I'm far from the only person who feels that way. In fact, the New Yorker's review of the film in 1941 quipped in reference to the controversy, "One can only feel that the Archbishop who opposed the showing of the film was Garbo's one true friend." Ouch. That maybe feels a little out of line, but Two-Faced Woman really and truly does make inexplicable narrative choices that, in my mind, completely warrant a sassy response. The first 5 minutes represent everything wrong with the movie. The couple meets, we learn nothing about either of them, they disappear on a ski trip, reappear, and wouldn't you know it, they just got married. It's as if they said, "Hey, you know it would be fun? A rom-com in which you miss the entire process of two people falling in love. We don't know them or why on earth they like each other, so when they start fighting about their differences, you sort of feel like, well, yeah, you don't seem like a great match. Maybe a divorce is fine, actually. Not, boy, am I excited to see the crazy lengths these kids go to stay together in spite of being completely different." As studios are known to do, MGM seemingly learned the wrong lesson from its own success. To them, Ninotchka simply gave a green light to consider Garbo for comedic roles. This isn't necessarily wrong, but fails to consider specifically why Ninotchka worked. What beyond Garbo in comedy needed to be replicated to guarantee success? We already know that Q-Corp and the screenwriters of Two-Faced Women didn't have the time or money Lubitsch and Co. had for Ninotchka. But were they even the right team for this vehicle? Was this story even suited to Garbo? The screenplay of Two-Faced Woman is attributed to George Oppenheimer, who was best known for writing farcical material for the Marx Brothers, as well as Sam Berman and Salker Vertel, both of whom traditionally wrote romantic dramas. They're the Anna Karenina, Queen Christina team. Unsurprisingly, Oppenheimer took the reins on the humor and geared the screenplay toward physical comedy, sometimes verging on slapstick. Contrast this with Ninotchka, which deploys physical gags sparingly, but relies largely on verbal wit, something much more within Garbo's wheelhouse. Q-Corp isn't the director for this kind of humor either. He could absolutely direct comedies, Dinner at 8, The Women, but his expertise, like Lubitsch, lay in verbal sparring and strong characterization, which this screenplay doesn't have. Two-Faced Woman tries to replicate some of the elements that made Ninotchka sing. It attempts a similar arc, for example, the disciplined, serious career woman who is liberated by love. However, it tries to illustrate this transformation through what I consider one of the worst sequences in Greta Garbo's entire filmography. When we first meet Karen, she steadfastly proclaims that she doesn't dance. Later in the film, however, she has to dance out of necessity to legitimize Catherine as a distinct person from Karen. So, like in Ninotchka, she breaks down her walls, hits the dance floor, improvises a jig, and suddenly she's a veritable sensation. Garbo gives it her all, but it is just indescribably awkward to watch, or as the Time magazine critic put it, almost as shocking as seeing your mother drunk. It's not well choreographed. It's basically walking in a circle and clapping. This is one of those things Q-Core improvised. Her dress is awful. Costume designer Adrian was given so few resources for Garbo on this film that he literally left MGM, assuming they'd given up on glamour. And you don't believe for a minute that she's actually letting loose in a fulfilling, life-changing way. Greta Garbo is in an Irene Dunne role, and at a certain point, you start to feel bad for her. Many critics felt the same, going out of their way not to blame Garbo for a film they considered one of the worst of her career. That the experiment of converting Greta Garbo into a comedienne is not entirely successful is no fault of hers, wrote Variety. Had the scriptwriters and the director, George Cukor, entered into the spirit of the thing with as much enthusiasm, lack of self-consciousness, and abandon as the star, the result would have been a smash hit. The New York Times was less kind, however. The film decisively condemns itself by shoddy workmanship. Miss Garbo's current attempt to trip the light fantastic is one of the awkward exhibitions of the season. Though she is her cool and immaculate self in the role of the clean-limbed ski instructress, she is as gauche and stilted as the script when playing the lady of profane love. Everyone involved knew, unfortunately, that the film was not very good. Cukor said later, even while we were doing it, it had a chill, a portent of failure. Fertel wrote in her memoir, I thought Garbo was miscast. Unlike Ninotchka, in which Lubitsch had humorously exploited her unique personality, Two-Faced Woman demanded a flippant comedienne. Most significantly, Garbo herself wasn't happy. Not that she was ever typically pleased with her own work, but Garbo's comfort zone was small on a good day in a routine film. This had pushed her too far. Two-Faced Woman turned out to be a much more fatal mistake than MGM had intended or anticipated. By pushing her persona to new extremes, MGM had inadvertently shattered the illusion of Greta Garbo. They made a deity seem human, and not in a good way. Celia Ager wrote in the newspaper PM, the wickedness in Two-Faced Woman is not in its careless disregard for what are supposed to be public morals, but in its vandalism. In its story's frenzy to cover up its own emptiness, its sterility, its lack of any fine feelings, it makes Garbo a clown, a buffoon, a monkey on a stick. Karen Swenson adds in her biography, Greta Garbo, A Life Apart, that the effort to Americanize her by making her light and down to earth had a negative effect. The overzealousness of the wizards at MGM, erasing all traces of European decadence in Garbo, was her undoing. Image makers had intended to homogenize her uniqueness. Instead, Metro unwittingly subtracted a dimension from her. Two-Faced Woman is often branded as a wholesale flop because it's bad, but in reality it was a modest success. It only lost a small sum at the box office, which was partly the result of Garbo's salary during retakes and the additional work necessitated by the Legion of Decency. In other words, the movie wasn't great, but audiences weren't actually eager to abandon Garbo. They still showed up, and yet she never made another film. Greta Garbo didn't stop acting because of Two-Faced Woman. Not exactly, anyway. Two-Faced Woman was a symptom of larger forces at play and hinted at what might have been in store had she stayed at MGM. First, Garbo wasn't happy with the censorship the film had faced. Throughout her career, her films had proven to be largely immune from both censorship and the tight financial controls otherwise imposed on the Depression-era studio system. Two-Faced Woman proved that that would no longer be the case. She wasn't untouchable anymore. Second, her relationship with Louis V. Mayer had become increasingly complicated. They'd always had a somewhat fraught relationship, battling throughout the late 1920s over wages and publicity obligations. But Garbo's early career at MGM had broadly been shepherded by Irving Thalberg, whose taste skewed more toward literary adaptations and sophisticated dramas that suited Garbo really well. After Thalberg's death in 1937, Mayer's taste increasingly determined MGM's output. He preferred easily digestible Americana, which Two-Faced Woman indicated would be difficult for Garbo to adapt to. In that sense, Garbo's transformation into a comedian was not just a way of reviving something stale, but also a way to adhere to Mayer's vision for the studio. Would staying mean becoming a full-time monkey on a stick until she'd lost all credibility whatsoever? Relatedly, third, times were changing. Take a look at the dates on all of the news surrounding Two-Faced Woman, and you'll notice that some of this stuff literally happened like the day before Pearl Harbor. The onset of World War II altered the country and the film industry for good. It demanded new types of entertainment, new attitudes, and new faces. Mayer's sentimental Americana would coincidentally be in vogue. Garbo's European mysteriousness would not. And fourth, Garbo made Two-Faced Woman at 36 years old. She would not have been blind to the fact that MGM's most valued assets were literal children, and that MGM was quickly signing a new generation of stars like Hedy Lamarr and Lana Turner to represent a new decade. The clock was ticking toward 40, which meant facing a new casting reality regardless of whatever fashions or trends came and went. By all accounts, Garbo never intended to entirely leave the film industry in 1941. She and MGM mutually agreed to terminate her contract, but she initially planned to continue working eventually. It was common for her to take long breaks between films, and she remained open to pitches for years. But nothing ever seemed quite right. Others' ideas weren't tempting enough, and studios didn't find the ideas she offered very marketable either. Although personally, I would kill to see her play a gender-bent version of St. Francis of Assisi. Come on, MGM! But the longer you keep audiences waiting, the more pressure builds on a potential comeback. The more fear takes hold. Garbo was never an actress with a hunger to work, nor did she pine for the attention of stardom. With overwhelming anxiety and no real incentive to return, at a certain point, it just became easier to call it quits. She imposed upon herself after the last movie, silence, a silence she has never broken. Robert Schickel wrote, "She was a goddess who became technologically unemployed, and rather than face life and a career as a merely mortal star of the new sort, she chose to preserve her mythic quality, which of course, in our notably noisy society, means a form of isolation." And so Garbo became that ghostly, legendary figure you'd sometimes spot walking in Central Park. Her abrupt exit is often the focus of the story. After all, it's so dramatic and oddly definite. But it's also important to recognize how long she actually worked. By 1940, the press had already started praising her for her longevity. The mere length of her career is as remarkable as the legend, said the New York Times. 7 years is considered the normal Hollywood career. Miss Garbo has lasted 15. Almost all of her peers had either retired, been forced out, or had sunk to roles unbecoming of their former statuses. Pickford, gone. Bow, gone. Swanson, down but not out. Garbo alone had been able to stick around, and she got to decide for herself when it was time to go. This is just one aspect of Garbo's story, and there are so many others I'd like to explore. I'd love to talk about Queen Christina one day, her relationship with Salga, or dive back into those silent films. If you want to see more like this, please consider subscribing. I put out videos about classic Hollywood every month. It's Oscar season again. I'd wager if you're a fan of the channel, you're looking forward to seeing what this year's ceremony has in store. Around this time of year, a lot of people start thinking back about ceremonies past, the winners they've loved or hated, and if you're like me, the films that you still have yet to catch up with. After 90 years, there are a hell of a lot of nominees to check off your list, and if you're looking for a curated way to actually do that, Mubi has you covered. Right now, they have a collection called And the Oscar Goes To, which gathers some of the choicest cuts from the night of 1,000 stars. It's not your same old list of Oscar favorites. It's full of deeper cuts and things that are actually pretty hard to find. One I'm particularly excited about, Hester Street, Joan Micklin Silver's incredible debut starring Carol Kane, which rarely streams anywhere. But guess what? You can watch it right now on Mubi. Mubi is a curated streaming service dedicated to elevating great cinema from all around the globe. From iconic directors to emerging auteurs, there's always something new to discover. With Mubi, each and every film is hand-selected by a wonderfully talented team of curators. You can discover the best of cinema at your fingertips, streaming anytime, anywhere. You can get in the Oscars spirit right now, not only with Hester Street, but Pieces of April, Mustang, and Breaking the Waves. Simply by clicking the link in my description below, you can check them all out for free. If you love movies, it is the best singular click you can do on the entire internet. Just go to mubi.com/BeKindRewind for a whole month free. A world of cinema can be at your fingertips. Get your month free at mubi.com/BeKindRewind today.